Hey, Travis here, Exerciselab, another video for you guys today. So I'm a doctor of physical therapy for those of you who don't know me. Just here to talk to you guys about the latest product from Abmat called the range of motion pad. Basically, the idea is you can increase your scapular range of motion, and there's a reason why you might want to do that. So I'll be talking about whether this thing can make good on those claims, whether or not you guys need one, and if it sort of lives up to the hype, because apparently these things are selling out like hotcakes. So I just want to talk to you guys about my thoughts here at Exerciselab. If you want to learn a little bit more about this range of motion pad, stay tuned. And we'll get started. All right, so a quick rundown on how this thing attaches. So this is actually kind of elastic here, and it's got Velcro on it. One thing I noticed is, I don't know, this thing doesn't seem like it's stitched down extremely well, so I kind of feel like this might eventually come undone, but it obviously is new and it hasn't yet, but I was kind of maybe thinking that this might be a little bit stronger here. But nonetheless, it's got, pretty good Velcro. It definitely feels like it's got some stick on it. This is elastics, probably because they can accommodate different benches. And so I've got the Rogue bench here, so you put this thing around, just sort of marry together the Velcro, and then you've got this thing where you want it. Depending on how high you want, obviously you're going to probably want to put this thing in a position where your shoulder blades are going to be sort of in between, or basically this thing will be in between your shoulder blades. And so I'd be laying in this kind of position, and I can adjust the bench for my habitus here, and obviously from there I can be doing my presses, my flies, and that sort of thing. And I pretty much have fairly unrestricted scapular range of motion. I can feel my shoulder blades, or at least my paraspinals, kind of coming into this thing. But for the most part, I do feel a bit of a greater stretch across my chest. I do feel like I'm getting, some pretty uninhibited, for the most part, scapular range of motion, more so than if they were on a flat bench, kind of being tacked down sort of thing. So in that sense, I do think it kind of makes good on those claims. As far as the softness here, this thing actually is pretty squishy. It's a little squishier than I thought. Initially, I can squeeze this thing pretty easily, and I'm not even, gripping it that hard. One of the things about this pad you're going to notice is it does have this step off here. And so, rather than having kind of a slope, my back is kind of floating, in between this pad, which I'd say I'm probably not madly in love with that aspect about it. It'd be nice if I kind of had a little bit more, intimacy, so to speak, down in that area. It does the job as far as up top. I feel like this kind of gap in here probably leaves a little bit to be desired, but nonetheless, that's what they decided to do, and so that's how the range of motion pad attaches to the bench. All right, so basically the idea behind why you might want to use something like this is what we call scapular motion, or sometimes scapular rhythm. And the idea is that when you put this thing on a bench, my shoulder blades, when I say scapula, that's basically what I'm talking about, the shoulder blades, they have more liberty to move, because my scapula, which again is that shoulder blade, should pretty much be in sync with what's known as the glenohumeral joint, or the shoulder joint. And so when my shoulder moves and my scapula is not moving as much, sometimes we call that scapular dyskinesia, basically meaning your shoulder blade is not timing, or it's not syncing up the way that it should be with your shoulder. And those things tend to go hand in hand with shoulder pain and shoulder issues. And so one of the reasons why a lot of benchers have problems, there's a number of reasons why, in the shoulder department, is because of the fact that they're often tacking those shoulder blades down. They're often kind of, retracting them hard as they kind of bench to give themselves that solid, stable platform, which might be good from a bench pressing perspective as far as generating, maximum power. But it's not going to be as good from a long-term shoulder health perspective, because our scapula and shoulder blade really is designed, so to speak, to move in sync with my shoulder. And so again, if I were to come in on the bench without this thing, even if I'm not intentionally tacking my shoulder blades down, because they are butted up against a flat bench here, they're probably not going to be moving as much with as much fidelity as they would on something smaller, where they can pretty much not be inhibited. And so again, if I was in here, now all of a sudden my scapula can definitely close a bit more on this thing. I can kind of get around this more to let those shoulder blades move. Now the sacrifice, of course, and especially being on something squishier like this, is it does add an element of instability. So I'm not going to be probably using something like this if I'm going super heavy. Also, because of that step off that it has, I'm probably not going to be going super heavy, because I don't want to create sort of a fulcrum down here in my back. But that being said, if you're doing kind of higher rep burnout sets, more hypertrophy style training, that instability may not be an issue, because you're not lifting super heavy. You're going more for muscle fatigue in a sense. And so in that way, I think that's where this thing can come in and perhaps make a sensible addition. So now I'll give you guys a little sampling of how that will look in a real set. Basically, just going to do a chest fly. I'll show you guys a few with, my feet up on a bench, and I'll show you guys a couple with my feet down on the floor. It's going to basically accentuate that lumbar curve to kind of get more of a stretch. So I'll show you guys what that looks like now. All right, so that's basically my 2 cents on Abmat's latest edition. Again, the range of motion pad. You know, the real question I suppose you might be wondering is, do I need one of these things? You know, if any of those exercises make sense, if that scapular humeral rhythm thing that I talked about makes sense, then, you know, this could be a good addition. I think for somebody that's looking for, again, hypertrophy training, doesn't want to have that scapular inhibition, so to speak, or at least that kind of block, then this isn't a bad product at all. You know, again, this is a little squishier than I expected. I'm not in love with the fact that it has this step off here. You know, Abmat does a lot of great work. I do support a lot of their products, and so I'm not necessarily, you know, bragging on them. But as in the innovation department, I don't feel like this is necessarily reinventing the wheel at all. I think this is a pretty simple product. I wanted to just show you guys, you know, effectively, it's about half of a foam roller. And I actually, before this thing had you know, been invented, so to speak, I used a foam roller, a half roller, many times for that purpose. And they do make some that are, you know, basically this about the same size as this. They even make some of these that are softer. So, you know, as sort of a real quick and dirty way to improvise, which I like to show on this channel a lot, you could just get a half roller. Luckily, the price point on this one does not break the bank, though. Many of Abmat's products are somewhat generously priced, and, you know, again, I do like the fact a lot that they do make their products in America and hopefully pay their staff, you know, somewhat handsomely. So, you know, I'm not necessarily saying that they're, you know, way overcharging for their products, but they are on the pricier side. This one came in at around, I think, $30 or $40, so not terribly expensive as far as many of their other products go. So I do like that about it. So, you know, if you were to use a foam roller, you know, this thing doesn't really move that much. You know, yes, you are going to, you know, benefit maybe to some degree from this elastic, you know, strap here that you can fix it to the bench. These things really don't move a lot, though. So how much you need this, I'd say, is to be determined. They could have probably just put a grippier material. One thing about this thing is it's kind of slick here. Would have been nice if they would have had a tackier material like they have on some of their other Abmat products. But, you know, nonetheless, this is what they did. You know, here you could probably put a piece of this stuff called Dysum, which is sort of like that, you know, dishwasher stuff that basically makes it so something can't slip so easily. But again, by the time you add it in, maybe the price of one of these plus some of that, you know, you're approaching one of these guys. So in that sense, I'd say you could probably just get this. It isn't a bad product, and so, you know, I'd probably give it about a B or so here overall. Not a bad thing. I think, you know, obviously I have one. I'll probably use it. I don't know how often I will, but if I end up doing, you know, flies with dumbbells, you know, I honestly like doing flies a bit more with bands most of the time these days anyways, as I've spoken to bands, you know, many times on this channel. So I do pepper in, you know, dumbbell flies from time to time. It is kind of an old staple exercise. And so when I'm going to do something like that, I'll probably add this in. Probably not so much for like heavy bench pressing and things of that nature, because again, that squishiness just adds a little more instability. But, you know, who knows, maybe from time to time, if I'm not going too heavy, maybe if I'm working with the tsunami bar or something like that, where I'm not necessarily worried about, you know, pressing maximum weights, but maybe I'm doing more speed work or something like that. So I think this thing does potentially have a time and a place. And all that said, I feel like I'm kind of rambling here, so I'll go ahead and leave it at that. Nice job, though, Abmat. Again, I don't want to discourage any innovation. I don't want to discourage them from continuing to put out good products, which I generally think they do. It's funny enough, though, this was a collaboration, which I feel like the other product I kind of knocked on a little bit was their Preacher Curl Bench, which is also a collab. So not to say that all their collabs have been busts, but I feel like maybe their collabs have not been as stellar as some of their standalone products. So all that being said, again, I don't have any affiliation with Abmat, by the way, here at Exerciselab. Just a fan of their products. So please let me know if you guys like this stuff. Like and subscribe. Let me know what else you guys want to see. Good products, good content in the pipeline. And as always, I hope you guys have